Hi, everybody. My name is Noah McDonald. I am with SAFON here, and I will be speaking to you all about the history of African American land-based struggle, is the language that I use. First, before I move forward, I just want to say thank you to Raina for coming to me and giving me the opportunity to share what I've learned. I have been engaging in some work with SAFON, Southeastern African American Farmers Organic Network, around intergenerational land issues, and through my research and also through the discussion, I've been able to find a lot of information on really the deep fundamental roots of how we can address this lack of land issue. So yeah, I just want to give thanks to Raina. Let's move forward. So SAFON, so I'm a fellow at SAFON, and we are really we don't really have any peer organizations at the moment. We are the first and we're the only organization of our kind in the U.S. We promote ecologically sustainable black farming. We preserve the heritage of black farmers and agriculture, and we're dedicated to the transformation and creation of ag and land-based institutions for black liberation. We are a network of farmers, fundamentally. We originally, our founders, Mama Cynthia Hayes and Owusu Bandele, back in 2006, did workshops, organic certification workshops with black farmers in the Southeast. And the farmers wanted to continue the work and to have a peer network. So we currently, SAFON is that network. We work in 4 states in the Southeast on the ground currently, as you can see highlighted in green. But we work with, we have connections and relationships with sustainable black farmers in all of the states, including the U.S. Virgin Islands. And before I move forward, I just want to share kind of the beginnings and the formative piece of why I'm here, why I'm presenting. So I work around, like I said earlier, some intergenerational land pieces, and SAFON, we have a lot of farmers in our network, elders that don't have identified heirs or successors for their property, which is pretty indicative for black farming for the past century, really, and is a greater issue outside of just our network. And so I've been working on a project that seeks to essentially create a renaissance of black land-based living, and really try to connect younger people with elders so that we can begin farming. And as a part of that project, I did a significant amount of research around kind of like what are the foundations of this issue. And so obviously that led me to very deep historical research into colonialism, imperialism, and enslavement. But before I get started into that, I just want to center us in some pictures of some young people farming, elders, and historical pictures. I love pictures because they can immediately usher the past into now. So I particularly like looking at pictures of the past. But yeah. So, as I get started, I will be reviewing what I call land-based models that our ancestors and black people in the United States have utilized or been deeply influenced by, if we're talking about plantations. And this is really a deep analysis to see how those models were specifically structured, what their purposes were for, how effective they were, and how we can bring those lessons and those learnings into how we organize into the future. And so obviously the foundation is pre-colonial West and Central Africa. And so I did a little brief amount of research on how people related to the land, how land use was structured, and yeah, what was the model that was being used by our ancestors before they were brought over here. And so the terminology that I use, which some people would, which I encountered, some people would disagree with this terminology, but I'd say the kinship-based commons. And essentially what that means, the foundation of our ancestors' conception, we have to get to the foundation of their conception of the world, that the land is a self-aware living being, which witnesses and observes how we live on the land and can intercede in our life, really. And mainly what's talked about is like punishment, but also blessing. And the owners, who are considered the owners, are the ancestors and the unborn. They're the true owners of the land, and they are merged as one with the living deity that is the land. And while it's our task as the living people to be stewards and keepers of the land for both the ancestors and for the unborn. And there's just a couple of pictures here. I liked this is a picture of a town in Dahomey, which is a pre-colonial kingdom in West Africa, and I like this picture because it shows the plantain trees along the edges of the housing. And it was one of the better pictures that I could find of how people structured the landscapes. And I'll go in speaking a little bit about that. Is that fundamentally, because the land is a living being and a gift from the Creator, it cannot be owned. And so individuals can be granted use to the land, use rights or an interest in land by people who are intermediaries between the ancestors, the unborn, and living people, usually chiefs or spiritual mediums or spiritual people in spiritual traditions and positions. And so the land use pattern that you could see in the picture is that influenced the land use pattern. So you'd have like a focal point of the house or the family compound, and then on progressive concentric circles, roughly, not really circles, but just expanding out, you have different layers of land use. So the most immediately around the house is the kitchen garden and the orchard. So I just like that picture. And then I included a picture of Benin City because Benin City is a very interesting case of urban planning based on fractal design. And just really highlighting that, like, our ancestors were deeply, deeply intentional, and I would claim beyond my understanding of how to use the land. It extends beyond my understanding, especially if you're talking about creating a city based on fractal design. And that city was, unfortunately, mostly destroyed by the British. And so, like I was saying earlier, you know, individuals did not have exclusive right to land. They had the right for perpetual land use, and they could transfer that land use to their descendants. And that's a very important piece to distinguish, is that there was not considered exclusive rights, which we see as the hallmark of how Western civilization, all the colonizing nations, how they consider property. Property as an exclusive set of rights. I can bar this person from accessing this land, and that includes people. That includes anyone. It can be anyone. That was not a conception in most of pre-colonial West Africa. And so I'm just doing some context of this is the worldview that our ancestors are coming from when they come, when they were brought over here to the United States. Or so yeah, that is kind of the overview of what I like to call the kinship-based commons. It was more or less layered democratically with presiding councils of elders at different levels, usually but not always a male elder who kind of presided over the land management of an extended family, and then on top of the extended family, a council of those elders for the lineage, and then up another level is a council of the representatives of the lineage for the entire village, and then you have for the region, and so on and so on. So very layered decision-making capacity, and very deeply complex and intentional. That's something that I want to drive through. That's a good point. And so when you have a lot of our ancestors were brought over here really with those cosmological conceptions, right? That the land, you cannot have exclusive right to the land, to bar the land. And also, equally as important is that the person who originally works the land automatically has title, not title, but they have use rights to that land. So the original inhabitants, and that's how you have the establishment of extended families and lineages, etc. They all descend from an original inhabitant. That was definitely interrupted by the triangle trade, or as some people call the Ma'afa. That conception and that model for land use was interrupted. And so we have the formation of two land-based models that our ancestors were using, one, or being influenced by, or living under. One being maroonage, which I'm sure most of you all are aware of, but just brief, it involved an exiting from the plantation economy, a physical exiting. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of records about, but I'll go into that more. And then we also have the plantation, which we all pretty much know about. So the plantation is our ancestors' first really deep multi-generational introduction to the concept of private property with exclusive rights. That is kind of the place where our ancestors were introduced to that concept, where they saw that concept in action, and they saw the land being treated that way, the land as private possession of the owner or the planter. And at the same time, as we know, our ancestors' bodies were also private property with exclusive rights contained within the owner. And I just want to say that's really that concept of exclusive rights of private property, especially of the land or the water, comes from Roman property law. The Romans, Europeans did not always operate within this spectrum. The Romans introduced this as kind of an innovation, so to speak, and that has descended into how property law is now. And so I just want to include these pictures. So on the diagram of the Hopeton plantation, a big plantation in Altamaha River in Georgia, you can see how land use was arrayed. You know, it was arrayed to facilitate the accumulation of money. Like, that was the entire point. Whereas in the kinship-based commons, land is considered as a sacred entity, and is thought of in terms of relationship and obligation to other members of the community. And yeah, so I also wanted to kind of juxtapose the what it looked like living on the plantation versus within those pre-colonial cities and rural landscapes. And next, obviously, we have maroonage. And so these are kind of two big examples of maroonage. The Great Dismal Swamp maroons in northeastern North Carolina. Some people say as many as hundreds of people were living there in autonomous communities. Oh yeah, and I don't want to say that maroonage was merely limited to North America. Maroonage was widespread and present in nearly every single country or colony that Africans were brought to. Cities, political entities, governments. I mean, so when we talk about maroonage, maroonage is not only the physical removal of yourself from the plantation, but also could be seen as a spiritual and psychological removal from the plantation. And, you know, people talk about decolonization, you know, decolonize your mind and everything. Well, this is like a foundational example of that. And then here, John Horse, a famous Afro-Seminole leader, war leader, and chief, and I'm sort of just uplifting that legacy, that maroonage, oftentimes, but not always, but oftentimes, happened in concert with alliances between the first peoples of this land, native peoples. In the case of John Horse, the Seminole, who were a group of a newly created nation from refugees from the various wars that the colonies were waging upon the southeastern nations. You know, the Choctaw, the Muskogee, the Chickasaw, and also some tribes from Florida. So yeah, that's maroonage. Unfortunately, the history of maroonage has really been hard to recover because mostly we just have archaeology. There's not really written records, and then if there is oral history, you know, that's not accessible to me because I don't know anyone, and there was no stories passed down to me about maroonage, but I'm sure that is the case for some people. And then with the onset of emancipation, emancipation presents us with this completely this new case of, okay, now our ancestors' bodies are not being owned as private property with exclusive right, but the land is still that way. And we have had multiple generations of our ancestors grow up within the model of private property and exclusive right to land. And I want everyone to pay very specific and detailed attention to kind of how that has influenced the way that our ancestors have organized around land-based living and land-based liberation. Because we have kind of, it's very complicated the way that our ancestors interfaced with the notion of private property. And so basically we have the conception of the utopias and social experiments, which were predominantly led by white Northerners, the U.S. Army, and a very small handful of white Southerners. And in this context, our ancestors still were largely not literate. They had very little access to capital. And also, they deeply, deeply, deeply desired to possess land. When you can find primary source documents of the absolute, like, deep, I would characterize it as a deep spiritual hunger for land at the onset of freedom. And so there's a lot of examples. I have a limited time span, but there's Sherman's Field Order, which confiscated land from Confederates and planters that had deserted the Sea Islands from northern Florida to southeastern North Carolina and granted it to freed people. And that was kind of a really first example of widespread land redistribution in the United States, and brought our ancestors under the legal umbrella of land, real property law as it is now, which is the exclusive right to land, exclusive private property right to land. But at the same time, you have this deep level of chaos, as we all know, during the Civil War. And a great example of kind of in the legacy of Maroonage is the Combahee River Colony, which was founded and run by Gullah Geechee women in the Sea Islands. And they basically, as the planters fled the Sea Islands, they ran their society. While the men were away fighting or assisting the Union as spies, or et cetera, they reorganized the social relations on that plantation and essentially ran society. And so that's deeply within the legacy of Maroonage, especially when we're talking about the restoration of women in female and femme leadership within land-based living. It's a very important part, but at the same time you have these social experiments such as the Port Royal experiment, and also a couple of others like the Penn Center, the Penn Center at the time. They were founded by white philanthropists from up north with the goal of integrating newly freed people into society, so to create them into citizens. And so here we have a deeper, more formalized education into this land-based property. This conception of property as private property and exclusive land rights. And interestingly, the next model that we kind of see develop is the joint stock company during post-Reconstruction, and corporations and joint stock companies. And I would add as the all-black towns, whether we're talking about the Exodusters or whether we're talking about in the Southeast, whether we're talking about Mound Bayou, whether we're talking about places in North Carolina, etc. This is kind of what I'm speaking to here. And you have what I would claim as an innovation of the concept of private exclusive ownership to fit the inherited and cultural social relations of pre-colonial Africa. Now I'll get into what that means. So frequently, when we talk about these joint stock companies and corporations, here are two great examples. The UNIA is bread and butter example of a joint stock company, a more formalized example of what we can call it. And then also we have here a picture of the founders of the Farmers and Mechanics Bank in Durham, North Carolina, which was a really anchor financial institution for black farming in northeastern North Carolina. And so with the joint stock companies, more often than not, they were actually informal, and they involved groups of freed people pooling financial resources in order to purchase land collectively, and then have individual shares within those. So we kind of, as you can see, we kind of have this amalgamation or this combination between a commons-based approach and the individual exclusive property right approach. And within these, like for instance, a good example of that is in North Carolina, there were the freedmen of Lenoir County. There were 250 men involved. They had I believe, $60,000 goal, and they paid, or a $10,000 goal, and they paid monthly installments of $4 into the pool, and then they were able to acquire land for their members. And this was a very widespread phenomenon within the Black Belt in the Southeast, which Lenore County is very, very close to. And so here you see kind of we now have the space to be, our ancestors now have the space to be more autonomous. Many folks were literate at this point. We had a little bit more capital, more access to education. At this point, we kind of have the, the establishment of Tuskegee and different industrial schools and training schools. So you have this really deep knowledge sharing and knowledge gathering and wisdom sharing. And here you also see, of course, the creation of a Black landowning class. Remember, the time period for this is 1877 to the 1890s. And at this time, our ancestors already owned millions of acres of land. And so this kind of continued to exist. And I want to say that these models are not kind of sequential step by step, even though I've articulated them in that fashion. They bleed into each other. They change, they morph. And so this is a great quote that I wanted to include that I really feel encapsulates the land ethic that our ancestors were thinking of. We feel it to be very important that we obtain homes, owning our shelter and the ground, that we may raise fruit trees, concerning which our children can say, these are ours. And so here we have a pretty explicit continuation of recognizing that what we are doing now is for our children. The way that we exist on this land and we use this land is also determined by the wishes and the life and the sustainability and the vitality of our children. How we want our children to succeed. We're building the world for our children. And so out of that model, you kind of see, this is, I want to also say this is a post financial crash. So unfortunately, by 1910 was really the peak of Black land ownership at 15 to 16 million acres of land, but most of that land was actually mortgaged, and so with the financial boom, people couldn't pay their mortgages. Financial crash, excuse me, was a crash. People couldn't pay their mortgages, and that was when it really started. Land started being lost. You have the industrialization of agriculture, etc. But at the turn of the century to World War II, you have the emergence of what I call cooperative unions. And these are really what you could call full agricultural service cooperatives. While there is private land ownership with exclusive rights, people have deeds. This is when you can start, if you're working with air property, you can go all the way back here because people have title, people have deeds, etc. But we still have this very deep collaborative, collective approach to living on the land, and to farming, and to agriculture. Most of the members of these cooperative unions were actually laborers, sharecroppers, or tenant farmers who pulled their resources together to buy essential tools and inputs for their production at wholesale prices, so that they could then save that money with the ultimate aim of gaining land themselves. And so that was like a very formative strategy that we see. And at this point, we have really, besides the UNIA, the largest African American organization ever to exist, called the National Federation of Colored Farmers. And we have 1 million people who are members of that at their peak, in 1886. So like I said earlier, the collective purchasing of inputs, but not only that, we also have people mobilizing their knowledge to consult for better work contracts for the different members. Also, they're orchestrating strikes, labor strikes, etc. And they also sought to link their members with national markets for their production in Chicago, New York, and also even Baltimore. And they had a pretty sophisticated infrastructure. They had a newspaper, they had a communication body, they had their own warehouses, very, very, very deep. And they were pretty successful by all accounts. Unfortunately, they fell apart because of a variety of reasons, which I would boil down to the fact that they were fundamentally linked to global agricultural commodity markets, and with the crash of cotton prices, and really the crash of all crops, corn, cotton, tobacco. At this time, tobacco the price went back up later, but it pinched people deeply, and that's another reason. And then the most salient reason was white terrorism. We have very horrific instances of lynchings and preemptive violence and murder to black farmers, farm laborers, sharecroppers, and tenant farmers at this time. And that really led to the crumbling of this model, unfortunately. And then, as you can see here, maroonage is a little dotted line, so we're going to see where that ends up. Here's a couple pictures of striking members of the National Colored Farmers Alliance and Cooperative Union, and some peanut farmers in Virginia. Our last model currently came about through the Civil Rights Movement is the Community Land Trust. I think I didn't know this before, but the Community Land Trust was actually started by African Americans, the concept of a Community Land Trust. I was not aware of this until I learned about the story of New Communities in Albany, Georgia. They were founded in 1969 at the height of the Civil Rights Movement as a place for evicted sharecroppers and tenant farmers and laborers who were being evicted or their work contracts canceled by white landowners because they were organizing for voting rights. The number of civil rights workers, Charles Sherrod, Slater King, and Shirley Sherrod, organized, and they acquired 5,000 acres in southwest Georgia for those farmers and farm workers who were evicted from or kicked off the land that they were working. And they actually based their legal structure, interestingly, on, they visited India and Israel, and they looked at cooperative forms of land ownership and farming, and they decided to bring that back and formalize it and create the first community land trust. So with the community land trust, we see kind of the ethic of self-determination re-emerging, but collective self-determination. And so the hallmark of the community land trust is that there's the community land trust is a board or a council or a group of people, which each of them individually do not have exclusive right to any of the land, but the land is held in trust or in common by all those folks. So in the case of New Communities, you have collective farm management and also collective farm marketing. So we really, for me, I really see community land trust as a deeply potent tool for land-based liberation because I see it as they can be a way to revive the kinship-based commons, especially if we're talking about family trusts or working with heir property, I think a lot of people see air property in kind of this like derogatory sense, but air property actually gives us the opportunity to recreate the kinship-based commons. I myself, my family, we have air property, and I am in the very beginning stages of trying to do that very thing. And so I think this collective approach to land ownership and land use and land stewardship, I had hesitate in saying ownership, is really, for me, I think, the most potent and fruitful organizing method. And so with that, I just want to say thank you for tuning in to my presentation. Fortunately, it was a little longer than I would have liked, but feel free to reach out to me if you have questions or you want to, questions, concerns, anything. My email is fellow@saafon.org. That's FELLOW@SAAFON.org. Again, my name's Noah McDonald, and I appreciate y'all listening in. Thanks.